Chapter 11. Evolution of Conscience and Religious Principles. When I say that there comes a time in the history of every fully and normally developed man or woman when the subjective mind rightfully and normally assumes the ascendancy, it will seem like a contradiction of what has been said of the law of suggestion and of the normal dominancy of the objective mind under that law. It is, nevertheless, true that the time does come when the subjective mind assumes a normal and a rightful supremacy. It is not, however, an exceptional violation of the law of suggestion, but a legitimate and direct consequence of that law. The time when this psychological phenomenon is witnessed is when conscience becomes an instinctive quality or emotion of the individual. A very few words will make my meaning clear. Conscience, like every other emotion of the human mind that distinguishes it from the mind of the brute, is a secondary instinct. It is, in fact, the ultimate instinctive emotion of the human mind as manifested in this life. It is, moreover, the strongest emotion of the human soul, for it is reinforced by all the higher instinctive emotions that characterize mankind in the higher stages of civilization. And here let me say, parenthetically, that in dealing with the subject of the religious emotions I shall take as my example the normal development of conscience, and that I employ that attribute as an illustration because it is, in a sense, inclusive of all the higher emotions of the soul. Conscience, in the ordinary acceptation of the term, covers everything in man's nature that has to do with the decision and direction of moral conduct. Ethically considered, it has been defined as the power or faculty in man by which he distinguishes between the right and wrong in conduct and character, and which imperatively commands and obligates him to do the right and abstain from doing the wrong. When the latter half of this definition may be accepted as a sufficiently exact definition of conscience for present purposes. But the first part is descriptive of an intellectual, perceptive, discriminative power or faculty, and not of an emotion. The impulse that imperatively commands and obligates is a motive, and not the discriminative power that distinguishes. It is true, as we shall see later on, that the discriminative power may become intuitional, but the distinction holds good nevertheless. The power or faculty in man which ordinarily distinguishes between right and wrong was originally purely intellectual. It was the result of long ages of observation and experience. In other words, it was the result of the exercise of the power of inductive reasoning, the observation and experience of humanity furnishing the facts from which to generalize. The grand result of this age-long process was such summations of human experience as the maxim, honesty is the best policy. This is the outcome of the reasoning of the purely intellectual, unemotional, utilitarian, objective mind. It is not a great moral principle. It is not even honest. It is a cold statement of a matter of policy. It is a statement of a bald fact that can be rendered into a homelier phrase without changing its meaning in the slightest degree. Namely, on the whole, it pays best to deal honestly. It is the cold, calculating, commercial conscience of the utilitarian world, but it possesses no more vital honesty, morality, or religion than do the statistical tables of an insurance actuary. It is, however, the best specimen of a conscience that is dreamed of in the philosophy of Herbert Spencer, and he gives the maxim, honesty is the best policy, as the summation of human experience in the moral and religious world. Point 1, and this conclusion is the direct and only legitimate outcome of his doctrine of utility and selfishness, of which I have before spoken. I do not, however, complain of Mr. Spencer's conclusion that the maxim quoted is the utilitarian outcome of his doctrine of utility, for he is obviously right. What I do object to is his doctrine, that the maxim is the summation of all religious and moral experiences. That is to say, the necessary implication of his philosophy is that all moral and religious sentiments were antecedent to the maxim. He recognizes nothing as the outcome of the maxim itself outside of its utility as a rule of civil conduct which, if followed strictly, will serve to keep men out of the penitentiary. Doubtless the world performed many moral and religious acts before the maxim was formulated. Otherwise, there would have been no means of ascertaining the comparative utility of good and bad actions, and the agnostic world would still be in doubt as to which would pay the greatest dividends in the long run. But Mr. Spencer stops with the maxim. It is, in his philosophy, the grand summation of moral and religious experiences. It is the conscience of the Spencerian philosophy, if indeed that great philosopher can be said to have recognized the existence of such a faculty in the human mind. It must be presumed that he did not, since the word itself does not appear to form a part of his psychological vocabulary. However, it does not appear that he recognizes any higher standard of morality or of religion or of altruism or of human conduct in any of the relations of man to his fellow men or to God than that embraced in the maxim. It is, indeed, impossible that the philosophy of selfishness and the doctrine of utility should lead to any other than a selfishly utilitarian generalization. From his viewpoint, therefore, Mr. Spencer is logically right in his induction. But, like most of the other great principles of the agnostic philosophers, the maxim in question is not a principle or a law of nature in the proper acceptation of the terms. Like natural selection, it is incidental to the great law of evolutionary development. It marks a step in the process of progressive psychological development and not the consummation of that process. The great psychological consummation of the evolutionary process is universal altruism, another name for which is universal honesty, not the honesty that is instigated by motives of policy, not the honesty that is based upon careful estimates of comparative chances for realizing dividends, not the honesty that finds its inspiration in the statistical tables of a moral actuary, but an honesty that is instigated by an instinctive love of right because it is right, by an intuitive apprehension of the eternal principles of right, by an irresistible impulse to do the right and abstain from doing the wrong. In short, the final goal of psychological evolution is the development in man of a conscience. Now, as before remarked, conscience is a secondary instinct, and it is developed precisely as all other secondary instincts are developed. That is to say, the first step is an intelligent adaptation to environment. The resultant acts constitute suggestions to the subjective mind. These suggestions are accepted, and the acts gradually become habitual, then automatic, and are finally converted into inheritable instincts. The process of developing an instinctive conscience is precisely the same in principle. It is much more complicated, and it consumes a greater amount of time, owing to the infinite complexities of man's environment. But the processes are psychologically identical. Thus, since the advent of civilization, the environmental conditions to which man finds it necessary to adapt himself are largely of a moral, ethical, and religious nature. In his dealings with his fellow men, he is constantly confronted with conditions that render it necessary to decide questions of right and wrong and to choose intelligently between the two. In other words, the cool, calculating, utilitarian objective mind has been engaged, since the dawn of civilization, in a process of inductive inquiry having in view the solution of the question as to what it is best for man to do when he has the power of choice between evil and good, between honest dealing with his neighbor and selfishness and wrong. The result of this age-long induction has been formulated by people of the higher civilization, that is, by those who have had the benefit of the greatest range of observation and experience, in some such generalizations as honesty is the best policy. This, as we have already observed, is the ultima thule of psychological development in the moral and religious worlds, according to the Spencerian philosophy. It is the conscience of the doctrine of utility. Here, then, we must part company with Mr. Spencer and his worshippers, for here is the very beginning, the primary step, toward the development of a true conscience. The intelligent reader has already anticipated me when I say that in the process of adapting himself to his environment, social, political, moral, and religious, man has reasoned up to the conclusion embraced in the maxim, and that and kindred summations of intelligent observation and experience constitute suggestions to the subjective mind, and that the resultant acts, at first intelligent and deliberate, afterwards become habitual and automatic in the individual and are finally converted into instincts. And I may here remark, parenthetically, that this is the only possible process by which conscience can become hereditary, for it is only those qualities of mind that become what we call, for the want of a better term, instinctive, that are inheritable. In other words, it is only those qualities or faculties of mind that become incorporated into the subjective mind that become inheritable characteristics of a race or species. This is as true of the higher qualities of mind as it is of the instincts of the lower animals. Hence it is that when conscience becomes instinctive, it becomes in the highest degree emotional, and it is a matter of common observation that when highly developed, and especially when it is reinforced by other instinctive emotions, it is the strongest and most powerful emotion of the human soul. The process of development is easily understood by those who have followed me in the earlier chapters of this book. As already pointed out, the utilitarian suggestion that honesty pays best in the long run is instantly seized by the subjective mind. But that suggestion is of small moment in itself compared to the deductions derivable from it. It must be remembered in this connection that, whilst the subjective mind is incapable of inductive reasoning, its deductive powers are potentially perfect. That is to say, it cannot institute an independent system of gathering facts from which to reason up to general principles. But once a general principle is established and conveyed to it by suggestion, it will reason deductively from that principle to all legitimate, logical conclusions with inerrant exactitude. Now, the general principle in the case under consideration is embraced in the maxim quoted above. It is a natural deduction to generalize the principle still further into "it is always best to do right." It is but a matter of deduction to infer that since it is always best for man in this world to deal honestly with his fellow men, it must also redound to his benefit in the world to come. Thus, the instinct of self-preservation is appealed to, first, in the maxim itself, which pertains to this world, and, secondly, in the deduction, which pertains to the next. Again, it is but a matter of deduction to infer that since it is always best to do right, it must be because it is pleasing in the sight of God, and thus the instinctive conscience is strongly reinforced by the instinct of religious worship. I have already spoken of the evolutionary or altruistic instinct as being normally stronger than the instinct of self-preservation. It is a matter of the most obvious deduction to correlate conscience with altruism and thus unite two of the strongest impulses of the human soul. Again, I have shown elsewhere that when one faculty of the subjective mind is excited to activity, it naturally tends to stimulate all its correlative faculties. So true is this that it has passed into a proverb: pity is akin to love. It has also been noted by many philosophers that religious revivals tend to the excitation of other than purely religious emotions. All these apparent anomalies are easily explicable on the theory that all the emotions, when normally developed and unperverted, are purely altruistic in nature and function, and are therefore so intimately interrelated that the excitation of one emotion stimulates all its correlatives, especially where there are two or more coexistent causes of excitation. Thousands of illustrative examples will be recalled by every intelligent reader, especially if he is acquainted with the abnormal tendencies often exhibited by psychics. This, however, is foreign to my present purpose, and it is only mentioned for the purpose of illustrating my meaning when I say that the excitation of one faculty or emotion of the subjective mind naturally tends to stimulate all the other faculties that are interrelated. When, therefore, conscience becomes an active principle in the subjective mind, it stimulates every emotion or faculty that is concerned with questions of right or wrong in human conduct. Now, the one great faculty of the subjective mind that is the normal correlative of conscience is the faculty of intuitive perception of essential truth or first principles. By essential truth, I mean the truth that it is essential for each sentient creature to know relative to the laws of its being. This knowledge is supplied by instinct, and it exists in the subjective mind of each sentient being, from the monarch to man, and it is exactly proportioned in each to its stage of development and its consequent needs. When, therefore, man becomes highly developed, morally and religiously, and conscience has become an active principle in his subjective mind, the faculty of intuitive perception of essential truth is developed in exact proportion. Were this not true, man, especially highly developed man, would constitute an exception to the general law. We know that it is true of the lower animals, from the primordial cell upward. We know that man is descended from the lower animals, and that the laws of his growth and evolutionary development are identical with those of his humble ancestry. Besides, we are not without examples attesting its truth in relation to man. The great exemplar was, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. His conscience was, without doubt, developed in absolute perfection. And we know now that his intuitive knowledge of the laws of the human soul, including the great principles of right and wrong, was correspondingly exact. I say we know this because modern science is powerless to disprove one essential tenet of his doctrine. It can only confirm. Other great exemplars are not wanting, differing widely in degree, but attesting the soundness of the principle. Some of the old prophets were highly endowed with the powers of intuition, as shown by the wonderful accuracy of some of their previsions. Nor are modern instances entirely wanting. This, however, is not the proper place to discuss this branch of the general subject in detail. It is introduced here merely for the purpose of completing my outline sketch of the process by which conscience is developed in normally constituted men and women, and to show what a strong moral energy is resident within the man in whom conscience has been developed on lines of perfect truth. I am speaking, of course, of the normal method of developing conscience in the normal man. Conscience, however, like every other faculty or quality of the human mind, may be perverted by wrong education or an unfavorable environment. The Inquisition was the result of perverted conscience. Religious wars are frequently the results of perverted or unenlightened conscience. In everyday life, among highly civilized peoples, perverted conscience often manifests itself in the utter inability of certain classes of people to adapt themselves to their environment. Thus, the cranky reformer, the fundamental tenet of whose creed is that whatever is wrong, is often merely a victim of a perverted conscience. It sometimes amounts to a moral insanity that is just as pronounced and often as offensive as total depravity. But, perverted or unperverted, conscience is by far the strongest emotion of the human soul, for the veriest physical coward will often face the cannon's mouth for conscience asterisk's sake, even in a bad cause. Fortunately for humanity, perverted conscience is the exception rather than the rule. Were it not so, medieval conditions would still prevail. More fortunate still it is for humanity that the inherent strength and energy of conscience as an agent of progressive development of the good there is in man depends entirely upon the character of the correlative emotions and faculties that are concerned in its development. Thus, if one's conscience is based entirely upon the instinct of self-preservation, that is to say, if fear of punishment for wrongdoing is the only incentive to right living, it is an imperfectly developed conscience, if indeed it can properly be designated as conscience. The same is true even if it is reinforced by the instinct of religious worship. Again, a conscience that is based entirely upon the altruistic instinct or emotion is still lacking in some of the essential elements of a perfectly developed conscience. I assume that in all the cases above mentioned there is still lacking an essential element, for one very good and, as I think, sufficient reason. And that is that history does not furnish an example where such partial developments were materially assisted by intuition. On the other hand, we have numerous examples, culminating in Jesus of Nazareth, where a conscience based upon a harmonious development of the three great instincts, namely, the instinct of self-preservation, the altruistic instinct, and the instinct of religious worship, was reinforced by an intuitive perception of the eternal principles of right and wrong. Now, I have already pointed out the fact that each sentient creature is endowed with an instinctive or intuitive knowledge of the laws of its being, and that this knowledge is exactly proportioned to its stage of mental or physical development, or, in other words, in exact proportion to its wants and necessities. I have also shown that man constitutes no exception to this rule. It is also true that this instinctive knowledge is never attained in advance of conditions that render it necessary. We have a right to expect, therefore, that when the process of developing man's moral nature commences, and the proper stage of development has been reached, his intuitions will be developed in exact proportion to his needs. Accordingly, we find that, in the evolution of conscience, at a certain, definite stage of that evolution, man does develop the power of intuitive perception of the essential truth pertaining to conscience. Obviously, the only general truth answering to the necessities of conscience is that embraced in the principles of right and wrong. That is the knowledge required to enable man to perform all his duties in perfection. We further find that man never attains that intuition until he seeks to develop his conscience upon the basis of the three primary instincts, never excluding or subordinating that of religious worship. The inevitable inference is, man owes duties to his God as well as to his fellow men and to himself, the last named being always subordinate to the others, and that a perfect conscience must be based upon those instincts which include all three lines of duty. It is obvious that any one of the three instincts would be sufficient to convert the principle involved in the suggestion into an instinctive impulse of dominating potency. But when the three are combined, as they are in every normally constituted person, conscience becomes an instinctive emotion of such supreme power that the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. It is then the strongest instinct of the human soul. Then it is that men will face the cannon's mouth for conscience asterisk's sake. Then it is that men and women will welcome torture and tribulation. In this world, and calmly yield up their lives at the stake rather than surrender the convictions of conscience. Thus, it is, and then it is, that the subjective mind of man, for the first time in all its history, rightfully and normally assumes the ascendancy. It is not because the law of suggestion has been suspended or modified, but because the autosuggestions of conscience are more potent than any suggestions that can be brought to bear against its convictions. This is the safeguard which the laws of nature throw around every human soul that is possessed of a conscience, and which forever guards and protects it, under all circumstances and conditions, from the suggestions of crime or immorality. It will thus be seen that at the very threshold of the moral and spiritual realm the soul stands ready to assume its rightful supremacy. It is its own domain, its native realm, for it extends over from time to eternity, and the soul alone is concerned with both. It is then that the soul becomes the inward monitor, the still small voice, which leads mankind in the ways of truth and righteousness.